All right, so we're going to talk about how you can interact with JSON APIs using Office apps through VBA. So it requires an external library, but it's going to be extremely powerful once you get the hang of it. So the way I'll demonstrate it is by interacting with the Harvest API. Harvest is kind of an online accounting service for businesses, and it has a REST API where you can send it requests to retrieve information, or you can post requests to add new information like new clients or new expenses, etc. Now, my motivation for using this JSON API is that they are upgrading from a version 1, which initially used both XML and JSON, whichever one you chose. So, for example, if we looked at the client's API in the version 1, you could retrieve an XML response, which VBA already has a built-in parser. And you can see it's pretty verbose. So you have a list of clients, and that has an opening clients tag and a matching closing clients tag. Then for every client, you still have to create an individual client opening tag and a matching closing tag. Then for every attribute, you have ID opening tag, ID closing tag, etc. It seems like a lot of unnecessary text. If you look at the JSON response, look at how much leaner this is. So we have this array of clients, we have the start of a client, and then we have only opening tags, ID, name, active, no closing tags, it just ends with a comma. Every object ends with a closing curly bracket. It's a very simple language, and it also doesn't have a lot of attributes like telling you about the format of the information contained. So I think this is the reason that for their version 2, they chose to work exclusively with JSON. So what that means is I can't use VBA's built-in XML parser anymore. I have to resort to another method for parsing their API JSON. So we'll take a look at a client's response from the version 2 API just to demonstrate the structure. So you'll have, if you request all clients, for example, you'll have an array of all clients. They'll each have their own opening curly bracket and then an attribute. So you'll have an array of options. There are some other APIs where the requests will have JSON objects as the attribute value, but we don't have to worry about that right now. So in order to parse a JSON API in VBA, we have to install an external library. So what we can do is Google VBA-JSON. And the first result should be a GitHub page that takes you to a VBA-JSON library created by Tim Hall. So this is a nice library that you can import into any VBA project, and it will convert a JSON string into a dictionary that you can iterate through and access data members by their string keys or by their numeric indices, whichever. So there are a couple ways that we can install this library. One of them is we can go to download and just download the zip, and we can just move this to our desktop, and I moved over here, and then you can just extract to this location. Another option, we'll create a new folder. If you have Git installed on your computer, you can pick any empty folder and you can open it in your command prompt. For Windows, it'll be PowerShell, and you can git init to create a blank Git repository. Then in the GitHub page, you'll have this URL that you can copy and then command git clone and feed it that URL, and it's going to do all this work for you. It's going to reach this URL and pull in all of the exact same information that's contained in this zip file. So it takes a little bit longer for the computer to work, but it's less work for you. It's not a necessary step though. The third option is that if you look at these, a lot of these files are just specific to the Git repository. They're only useful for developers, like VBA-block.toml. That's just a comment file for Git, Git ignore, Git attributes. Most of this is not necessary. License, don't go recreating this and then try to sell it. So most of it's not necessary. You could just download the JSON converter.bos. This is the only file that you need, and a BOS .bas is just a compiled VBA project that includes all of the source code and all of the libraries that it references. However, I still suggest that you download the entire package because the README file is actually very useful in here. It has some nice examples and some information about using this. So either option is acceptable. Either get the whole package or just get the BAS file. Either way, now that it's on our computer, we can start working with it. Now, we're going to be using the VBA in Excel, but all of these principles will be the same if you use it in Access or Word or PowerPoint or any other Office application. So Excel is going to start up and we're going to create a blank workbook. And then I'm going to hit Alt F11 to open up the VBA window. Okay. Now, how do we start working? And first I'll save it to the location that we just created on the desktop. JSON book, and we want to save it as an XLSM so that it's macro enabled. Okay. Now, if we want to start using the VBA libraries, we have to go to File, Import File, and then we're going to import this JSON converter.bas. Open that up, and now if we expand our modules, we have JSON converter here. And if we double click, we can see all of the source code. It's gives you some insight into how it works. It's nice to look through it, but it's not necessary to start using it. All that matters is that it's imported into our VBA project. Also, don't get hung up on this red text. This means that there's a syntax error. But if you look at these pound signs, these commands are directives, and basically it's only going to execute these statements if you're working with a certain version of VBA. So these statements aren't valid, but since it's detecting what version of VBA you're using before it executes these will never get executed, so we don't have to worry about them. Okay, so now let's create a new module. And if we want to start using the JSON converter, I know I said that we just had to import that library, but it requires that we make one additional reference. So if we go to Tools and References, we have to add in a reference to Microsoft Scripting Runtime. This is just a library that the JSON converter uses that we have to create our own reference to. Now we can start working with it. So we'll create a new subroutine. I'll make this option explicit so that we don't end up creating some new variables accidentally. Sub JSON example. Okay, so str JSON. This variable is going to be our JSON string. So let's create a super basic JSON string. It's going to start with curly brackets and close with curly brackets, and it's going to be enclosed in quotes. And then to enclose quotes within quotes, we use double quotes. It would be the same as using a backslash quotes in any other language, so it's escaped quotes. And then we're going to create our first attribute. We'll call it key1, and it is going to have a value 1. All right, and then we'll make a second key, key2, and its value is going to be value2. All right, it's very simple. So str.json equals this. And then we're going to create a new JSON parser dictionary. So what we're going to do is create dim jp as object. And the type that it returns is actually going to be a dictionary. It's not a custom JSON converter object. It's a dictionary very similar to a Python dictionary or a hash map in, for example, Java, or a JavaScript object. So the way that we're going to return this object is we're going to set JP. We have to use the set keyword because it's an object, equals JSON converter dot parse JSON. And the argument is going to be str.json. This is the string that's going to parse. Okay. And we'll put a dummy statement down here. Actually, we don't need to. We can put a breakpoint on end sub. So I'm going to execute this. Now, how do we know that this actually did anything, and how can we examine what this JP actually is? Well, if you don't have the watch window open on your VBA editor, you can just go up to View and open the watch window. And then what we can do is highlight JP, right-click, and go to Add Watch. So now this tells us all of the members that are available to the JP object. Okay, so we have a compare mode attribute, then we have a count, that's the number of elements here, key 1 and key 2. And then we have item 1, key 1, and item 2, key 2. So now we can end this statement now that we see what JP is made up of, and we can access the first member of JP. So we can add a debug.print statement, and it's going to print JP, and we access members or attributes through the string key. So JP key 1 we expect is going to give us the value associated with key 1, which we know is value 1. So let's try it out. There we go, value 1. By the way, if you don't have the immediate window open, this is the output window. Slash, it's also kind of a command prompt, but you just go up to the view and open the immediate window, and this is where all our output's going to get printed. Okay, so we saw how we can create a JSON string and access that JSON object to start getting the elements out of it. Now, what happens if we try to go a level deeper? Let's make another one called key 3, and instead of just giving it a string value, we're going to make its value another JSON object, and it's going to have keys sub key 1 with a value sub value 1 and sub key 2, and sub key 2's value is going to be sub key sub value 2. Now, what happens if we try to print JP key 3 the same way we tried to print out key 2 and key 1? When we had nice string values, we could just get it to print out value 1, value 2. How does it handle this JSON object when we try to print it? Oh no, wrong number of arguments or invalid property assignment. And it's going to get hung up on this statement. So the problem is we cannot just print a JSON object. What we have to do is dig into this object and pull out one of the subkeys so that we get down to the point where the value that it's trying to print is just a string. So key 3, JP key 3 is not a nice object, but JP key 3 sub key 1 is, And so now we expected to first retrieve JP key 3, which is not a string but a JSON object. Then within that returned object, or that returned dictionary, retrieve the item with the value subkey 1, or with the key subkey 1. Those extra parentheses that I put there were just for visualization. It apparently doesn't like those. Okay, subvalue 1. There we go. So we have to use what's called chain indexing to access objects within JSON objects. But either way, if it's a JSON object, something that's enclosed in curly brackets or enclosed in square brackets if it's an array, it's going to return a dictionary object and not a single value. Now, the next handy trick that we're going to use, let's get rid of this key 3 and get us back to our normal Okay, so we commented all of this out, and now we just have key 1 value 1 and key 2 value 2. A nice simple JSON one level string again. Can we iterate through these and get every key and every value in this JSON object? So let's try that. So let's create a new object, dim, and this will be ATT. Let's call it dict because it's going to return a dictionary object. And let's try a for loop. For each dict in str JSON, and then we'll do the closing next dict because we're going to forget about that. Okay, debug.print dict, and so first off, let's see what this does. Is this going to give us key 1 and key 2? Let's get rid of all this junk. Oh, why did I point to this string object? We want JP. Okay, I should not have declared this as an object because in this case it's just going to be a string, right? There we go, key 1 and key 2. All right, so that's nice. It gives us the string keys, but how do we get it to return value 1 and value 2 when we loop through? Well, we know that this is returning us a string key, and we know that we access these by using string indices that are named after these keys. So we should be able to go debug.print JP subscript dictionary. Let's try it. Get rid of this. There we go, key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2. All right, so now you can see how you can iterate through all of the keys and values in a simple one-level JSON object. Now, let's redo what we had before. This is now uncommented. We have value 2, key 3, and key 3 itself contains an object. Okay. So now we know that we're going to get an error if we try to get it to print the value at JP key 3, right? We delete all of this. Yep, here's our error. How do we get around this? There has to be a way that we can know ahead of time whether this is going to return a nice printable object like a string or a number, or if it's going to return us a JSON object. One way around that is we can check if isObject JP dict then, and you know what, I'm going to say not isObject. So if it's not an object, we proceed as normally. We just try to print out the value associated with it. If it is an object though, which we expect this to be, this will evaluate to true. Don't forget those end if tags, kids. All right, if it is an object, debug print. You know what? We can elevate this debug print key, because no matter what, the key is not going to be an object. The key is always going to be a string. Now we have to nest another for loop inside of here to loop through each of the sub keys. So then sub dict, and when you're creating for loop variables, it can be useful to not declare a class if you don't know what type of object is going to be returned, which is our case. Sometimes it's going to be a string that gets returned, sometimes the iterator is going to be an object. So we'll leave these without type declarations. For each sub dictionary in JP dict, I want to include that next, debug.print JP dict, our first sub dict, and debug.print JP dict, remember the chain indexing, sub dict. So what we expect to happen once it gets to key 3, it's going to evaluate that the value is an object. It's going to print each subdictionary in this JP of dict object, and then we're going to get it to print each sub value. So we expect key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2, and then for key 3, we expect it to print key 3, and then sub key 1, sub value 1, sub key 2, sub value 2. Let's see what happens. Beautiful. So, so we got it to print all of the objects included in here. Okay, so now that we've seen how we can iterate through JSON strings and we can work in multiple levels, multiple layers of JSON, let's try to create a JSON file and read from that. So str.json is going to get a new value once we create that file. So let's open up the folder where this is contained and create a new text file. Text document, and we'll call it auth.json. Okay, that's okay. Now, the purpose of our auth.json file, if we look at the documentation for our REST API, and we go to authentication, we're going to include these 3 headers in a request: the authorization and bearer, and then the value of the access token, harvest account ID, and then that value, and the user agent, which is going to be the email address associated with this account. Now, you should always store this information in a separate file for a couple of reasons. One, it makes it more portable so that if you want to distribute it and you want someone with different credentials to also be able to use it, they can easily substitute in their own credentials. B, if you want to distribute it, you don't want that file to already contain your own private user credentials. So that's why it's a good idea for anything that you plan to distribute, and really anything that you're using at all, to take credentials, even for your own personal use, from a separate file located in the same directory, just so you don't accidentally give it out. So this looks like a good opportunity to create a JSON file with our authorization token, our harvest account ID, and user agent. So let's open up that text file that we just created. We're going to open up Notepad++. You can open up any text editor. I just like Notepad++ because it's going to include the highlighting that we need. Okay. So let's put this over here and put our documentation over here and see what headers we're going to want to create. So the first one could be authorization, and let's try to use the exact same names that they're using in the documentation. Authorization, and then our auth token. So that's always going to first start off with the word bearer. and then a space, and then our auth token value. In this case, it's ABC123. That's my real auth token value, folks. Then harvest account ID, and that's going to be 555555. Okay, and then the last one is going to be user agent. And that's going to be, let's just pick the one that they used, your name at example.com. Okay, so now let's save this file and get it to start looping through the JSON that we have in this file. So let's create a couple of new variables that will have our file path. End file, this will be our file number as integer. Okay, and then str.json is now, instead of being this custom string, we'll get rid of this. It's going to be what we read from the file. So first we'll declare file path and open file. Let's just say read from file. We don't need this whole comment block. So read from file. We're going to open up. First we'll declare a file path. So it'll be this workbook path plus a trailing backslash and then plus, and remember that name, auth.json. All right, because we saved it in the exact same directory as this workbook. All right, and then end file equals free file. It's a function that VBA is going to use to find a unique identifier, the lowest available unique identifier for the file that we're about to open. So next we're going to open file path for input as £end file. And let's tidy up here and put a close £end file so we don't forget to close it. All right, then while not EOF £end file, I have to start with the do keyword. Loop. Okay, it didn't like that £. Okay. Now we have to create, what it's going to do is until we reach the end of the file, it's going to loop through and read each line successively in here. So what we need is an intermediate variable to assign to each line. So dim str line as string, str line input, str line end file. Did I get that order right? No, I have to switch the orders. End file, str line. All right, so it's telling you read from this file and assign the value that you read to this line. And each line is obviously just going to be one line, so until it hits the new line character. So we'll have to do that multiple times, and each time str.json equals str.json plus str line. Okay, and to get that started, we have to declare str.json equals an empty string. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing. So we'll leave this loop down here. It's going to loop through each of the values, and we expect it to print out authorization, bearer, ABC123, harvest account ID, yada, 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 and print out each of these keys and values. So let's see what happens. Is this an invalid JSON string? Of course I have to enclose this in quotes. Okay, let's try it again. All right, here we go. Authorization, bearer ABC123, harvest account ID, 5555, user agent, your name at example.com. One interesting thing to notice here, for the integer 555555, remember we didn't enclose this in quotes. However, when we went to the when we used the read line file, it read everything in as a string, and then when this was fed into the JSON parser, it actually counted 555555 as a string that included that leading space. So that's something to be aware of in the future if you ever start running into weird errors with this. Okay, but now when we want to put together our request to retrieve live data from Harvest, which will be our next step, we already know how to get the header information that we'll need to authenticate ourselves. All right, so let's do that. Let's start. Let's move on to getting live data. So let's pick something. Now, first off, for the authorization, I used fake data. I have preloaded on my desktop an actual auth.json folder that has my real credentials. So I'm going to open up that folder again, and I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy it over to this file, and I'm going to replace it. So now auth.json actually includes real authentication information, and we can start figuring out how to use it, or send our first Harvest request. All right, so we can go to, what's a good one? Roles.api. So the way this is going to work is there's a base URL, which is apiharvestapp.com, https apiharvestapp.com, and then to get the roles, we're going to create a /v2/roles. So this is the URL that we're going to end up sending as an HTTP request to Harvest, and it's going to be a GET request. We're not sending it any information, we're just retrieving information. And here's the JSON that it's going to reply with. It's going to give us roles, and then in case you don't know, the square brackets in JSON indicate the start of an array. So it's going to be an array that consists of these objects that are each enclosed in curly brackets. So each role is going to have an ID, a name, a user ID, a time that it was created, and it's just going to be enclosed in quotes. It's going to come in as a string, and the time that it was last updated, also a string. So let's start compiling this request. So in order to send an HTTP request, we have to add a new reference. And this is going to be the Microsoft Win HTTP request. This is the library that it uses to send HTTP requests. It's going to be critical for reading or interacting with REST APIs. So we're going to dim rec as Win HTTP request. And then down here, set JP equal to, set rec equal to, and it's going to be new Win HTTP request. You have to initialize it as a new variable. Okay, now here's where that auth.json folder is going to become handy. We now have this JSON object, this dictionary that contains all of our headers. And we know that we don't have to worry about evaluating whether or not the returned value is an object because there's only one level here. So everything will just be a string. Okay. So what we want to do, why does this look wrong? To set up the authentication, we're going to say rec.set request header, and the value is going to be the key or the name of the header, and the value is going to be JP indexed by that dictionary object. Okay, and before we can start setting headers, we have to create the URL that we're going to send it to. All right, URL is going to be this thing right here. And rec.open, the method is going to be get, and the URL is going to be URL. Okay, so this is what we have to do before we start assembling the request, is we have to give it a URL and tell it what method we're going to be using. So as it loops through each of the attributes in the JSON file, it's going to assign each header based on the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute. And then finally, the return value is going to also be a JSON string. So we're going to call this role JSON. And this is going to be the request.response text. Okay, and we'll have it print out role JSON. Let's see what happens. Can we retrieve information from Harvest now? Of course. Why did you guys let me forget to go request.send? So let's execute that statement. And there we have it. It returned our roles data, and it is just a ugly, jumbled, compressed JSON string. No new line characters, no extra spaces, nothing to make it human readable, just completely minimalistic. It makes it a lot quicker to transfer. So we're going to want to do what we've been doing and create a new JP object. Let's take this JP object that we were using above. Let's create a new one. JP roles as object. So JP roles equals, we have to set it because it's an object. JSON converter dot parse JSON, and it's going to be role JSON. All right, so if we try to examine this, and it's not going to be easy to examine in this form, but let's look at the example format. Yeah. So the first attribute that it's going to have is going to be the roles attribute. So roles equals JP roles. All right. And I believe we'll have to set it because it's going to be an object. Now, it's going to return an array. With JSON arrays are not indexed by their string index or their string key, because so they're accessed by just their numeric index. And these are 1-based, they're not 0-based. And VBA can be kind of inconsistent about that, because with arrays, they're 0-based, but for example, with collections or dictionaries, they're 1-based. So the first one is going to be 1. So let's loop through, let's create another iterator object, dim role key as, we won't declare class type. Sorry, dim role. Okay, so for each role in roles. All right, so that's going to return each one of these objects. Next role. Okay, and then dim attr, this is going to be the attribute of role. For each attr in role, next attr, debug.print. Oh, so we're going to have it print the attribute, and then debug print role attr. So this is the same thing. It's going to return the key and the value. And let's okay, we already got rid of the other debug.print statements. So all we should expect to see are the ID name, user IDs of each one of these objects. And at the end, when we move on to the next role, just to make this a little bit easier, let's debug print VB new line, just as a separator. JP roles. Oh, well, first off, I should define roles. Yeah. So these should not be JP roles. This should just be roles. How could it be a type mismatch? Roles is nothing. JP roles. Okay, what's the attribute? User IDs. For user IDs, it returns an array of IDs. So we'll have to do the same nested for loop. So this will be the case if not is object role attr debug different, and it's VBA, so you have to use the then keyword, and then we'll have else and if for each, so we'll have to define a new iterator. We'll just call it sub attr, or no, since we know it's user ID, user ID, so ID in attr role attr, next user ID debug.print user ID debug.print role attr user ID. So let's go back to where it Duplicate declaration. User ID is only declared once. Dim user ID. Okay, that's definitely not true. There is no duplicate declaration. Okay. Let's just call it UID. See if that satisfies it. Of course we can't use this as an index. Okay, so we just want to debug.print UID. It's just going to be the object contained in there. It will not have an index. There we go, user IDs. So for every one of these, we have an ID, a name, created at, updated at, user IDs, and each user ID in there. All right. Now that we have the ability to pick this apart, you're pretty much infinitely powerful. You can take this and integrate it with whatever spreadsheets you want or access databases you want. And we used it on the Harvest API, but pretty much every major website now has some kind of JSON API. Most of the social media sites, accounting sites, job sites, anything, news sites, financial sites, all of these have REST APIs that you can interact with. And now that you can use these in VBA, you can integrate these with any basic Office application that you want. All right, hope this was helpful.